Greetings, this is Edward, the MetaTutor, here to talk about Python variables and functions. Specifically, we are talking about variable scope, which is the idea that variables have only a specific lifespan or a specific part of code from which they can be called. This is a very important lesson for a lot of my students who are, just now learning about functions, or who are, who have learned about functions for the first time, or who are struggling a lot applying functions to their code. Maybe you're working on your first project, and you keep getting errors where you're trying to create a score variable, but it's always set to 0 even when you increment it in one line of code. That's a very common error or bug that my students come up against, and so I want to explain the reasoning behind those errors. So to begin, I want to define the word scope. So we are using scope in the sense of a range or breadth of a thing. So for instance, if we were to say we widened the scope of our investigation, what we are trying to communicate is that we are now including more things in our view and in our consideration. And so the scope of a variable means essentially the range of code, or the how far away in code you can refer to a variable with it still existing. I also refer to this very frequently as the lifespan of a variable. When you first start to code, you often write your code either directly into the shell, like so, or into a script, but without using functions. And when you start using functions, scope becomes a problem, because some variables are, they have their scope defined by a function. That is the primary way that you define the scope of a variable. So for instance, if I were to just simply set a variable a equals, let's say 5 in the shell, then for the entirety of my session using this shell, I can print a and it will work. I can, create a function and, do whatever I want. I can print a using that function. Boom, it works. It refers to a, and it knows what a means, no matter what the context is. This is a little misleading because this is a very limited scope. So with all this work over here, that's something that a lot of my students are comfortable with. They might try to bring that over here and say, all right, a equals 5. Let's print a, and then let's create a function called my function, print a, and then call my function. And it works totally fine. It does the exact same thing. It prints 5 twice. But students then will try to do something like this. They'll create another variable, b, and set it equal to 10. And then in another function, let's say second function, students will try to print b. So then they'll call second function at the end of my function, and they're going to get an error. Specifically, the name error, name b, is not defined. So name error is something that you'll frequently encounter working with variables or functions. Name b is not defined means that at this line of code, second function has no idea what to do with b. You're telling it to do something with b, and it has never seen a b before. And that's because the scope of the variable b is inside of my function. Same thing if we try to print b out here. Let's get rid of the second function now. Let's just comment it out. Again, we get an error with name b is not defined, even though I'm not using that or even though I'm not in another function. So I want to double check that that's doing what I want it to do. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So this is line 12, right? And then line 20 is this one down here. I'm going to modify my code now. I'm going to get rid of all references to b. Since we now know that since we now know that the scope of the variable b was simply the function my function. If we define something inside of my function, then that is its scope, and if we try to call it from outside of that function, it won't work. But what if we were to break programming or programmer convention and create a second variable a? I say break programmer convention because I want to advise you not to do this. It is inadvisable to create two variables with the same name for a lot of reasons. If you can avoid it, please do. And I think that in most situations you can. But I want to do so just this once to define global variables and local variables. So the first a is a global variable because it is defined outside of a function. It is the main runtime of the code. Right, when Python runs, it runs from top to bottom. It sees a equals 5, and it makes that a true. It declares that a exists for all functions, no matter what. We already saw how if I get rid of this line altogether, right, print a works in here because of the a equals 5 out there. But that is a global variable, meaning that I can use it in many different functions, and that's helpful. For instance, if you're wanting to keep track of score in a game or something like that, that's normally very helpful. Let's go ahead though and see what happens if I'm going to declare the global variable a equals 5. I have a function where I say a equals 10, and I run that function. I print the value of a after it runs, and I want to see what's going to happen there. And I'm just going to make a quick mark here, and I'm going to say global like that. So I'm hoping that that will work. Local, whoops, that's what I wanted to do. Yeah, like that. So what I'm expecting to happen is, since we're inside of the my function for this print statement, it's going to print the local a, which is equal to 10. And that is a declaration. That is a totally different a value than this a up here. They are totally different. I might as well name it something else, but that's not the point. The point is that this is a local a variable, whereas this one is a global a variable. So I'm going to print local, and I'm going to get 10. And then when I print global, I'm going to get 5, and that's because it's calling this a variable. This statement right here, a equals 10, is not changing this value. It is simply declaring that there is a new a in town, and it is 10. So let's see this run. Local, 10, global, 5, exactly as I said. And so this is yet another way in which my students struggle with, for instance, keeping track of score in games. If I am trying to change the score, right? Let's say that I were to change this away from score, which, obviously we want to start off, equaling 0. If I were then to try to change score, set it equal to 1, then I'm going to get two different answers, right? I'm going to, I didn't change the rest of it. Score and score. There we are. If I run this code, again, I'm going to get 1 and then back to 0. So the problem as it stands right now is that if we want to call score inside of a function, rather than referencing the global score, Python makes us a local score, and we want to get around that. The way that you do that is very straightforward. All you do is type global score, and that creates a reference to the global score variable in your function. So now if I make a change to score, it's no longer going to be a local variable, but a global variable. It's now the global score. So let's say I want to set that equal to 3. Inside of the method, or inside of the function, sorry, I'm going to get the score of 3, but outside, I'm also going to get the score of 3. Boom. I can also use this, to do something a little bit more straightforward, like just change the value several times. So let me call my function 3 times. There we are. So we're going to see inside the function as it adds, 1, 2, 3, and then outside the function, the variable keeps that value. It doesn't revert. So the global keyword, we write global and then whatever variable it is that we want from the global context, and that imports it into the function so that we can reference it. So that's one of the most straightforward ways of doing this.